People like to talk about $1 million because it sounds dramatic. I have spent most of my life looking at money in a less theatrical way. The numbers that change a life are often much smaller than the numbers that impress a room. $1 million attracts attention. $10,000 changes behavior. That is a different thing entirely. If you have never had $10,000 sitting still in one place with your name on it, the number may sound modest. It does not buy a house. It does not let you retire. It does not turn you into some grand capitalist hero strolling around with a cigar and a private plane. But I have watched money long enough to know that the first real shift in a person's financial life rarely happens when the world thinks they are rich. It happens when panic loses its grip. That is what the first 10,000 really does. It does not make you wealthy. It makes you harder to frighten. Most people spend the early part of adulthood in a state of permanent financial reaction. They do not experience money as a tool. They experience it as a series of alarms. The rent is due. The card balance is higher than expected. The car makes a strange sound. The laptop slows down. The dentist says something that begins with the phrase, "We should probably." And suddenly the month is no longer a month. It is a problem. When a person lives that way long enough, the damage goes far beyond the checking account. The obvious damage is financial, but the deeper damage is mental. Every choice gets filtered through scarcity. Every decision gets colored by threat. Every surprise, even a small one, arrives with the emotional weight of a disaster. That is not a budgeting issue. That is a nervous system issue. People imagine financial insecurity as a math problem. Sometimes it is. More often, it is a constant interruption of clear thinking. I have always believed that one of the best things money can buy is the ability to think straight. The world tends to describe this backwards. It tells people that if they become clever enough, disciplined enough, or lucky enough, then they may eventually earn the right to feel calm. In reality, a certain amount of calm is what allows good judgment to appear in the first place. A person with no buffer does not make decisions from preference. They make decisions from exposure. They are not asking, "What is wise?" They are asking, "What can I survive this week?" Those are not the same question. That is why 10,000 matters so much. It is not because 10,000 solves every problem. It is because 10,000 changes the size of the problems that can still terrify you. When I talk to people about money, many of them think the first meaningful milestone should be some glamorous number. 100,000, a $250,000, $1 million. They think anything below that is just warm up. I do not see it that way. The first 10,000 is the line between being financially naked and having a coat on. You can still feel the weather. You are simply not standing in it bare. That changes a person more than they expect. When you have no savings, life feels like a series of hostage negotiations with reality. You stand in the grocery aisle doing arithmetic over cereal. You look at a dinner invitation and measure it against the electric bill. You delay replacing shoes that are already tired because the month has other demands. You feel a pulse of dread when the dashboard lights up, when the pet refuses food, when the company schedules an unexpected meeting, when the landlord sends a message that begins with, "Just wanted to let you know." People who live with money often underestimate how exhausting this is. Every one of those moments consumes mental bandwidth. The cost is not just the expense itself. The cost is the anticipation, the vigilance, the constant rehearsal of worst-case scenarios. That kind of life teaches the wrong lessons. It teaches people that every dollar is fleeing, that every plan is temporary, that every calm period is merely an intermission before the next hit arrives. Then one day there is 10,000 in the account, not borrowed, not floating on a credit card, not promised in a tax refund that has not arrived yet, not imagined in some future raise, present, visible, real, and something quiet happens. The person may not look different from the outside. They still go to work. They still compare prices. They still think before buying something foolish. They do not suddenly become extravagant because the number has 5 digits. The change is inward. The check engine light is no longer a prophecy. It is an inconvenience. The late-night thought about losing a job is no longer a vision of immediate collapse. It is a serious concern that can be managed. The broken appliance is no longer a family emergency. It is a problem with a price attached. That emotional downgrade matters enormously. If you have never been poor, you may think panic and inconvenience are roughly the same category. They are not. One hijacks the mind. The other merely interrupts the day. The first 10,000 moves many common problems from the first category into the second. That is a major promotion in the quality of a human life. The interesting thing is that most people misunderstand where the value comes from. They think the value of an emergency fund is in spending it. A great deal of the value is in not spending it. It is in the knowledge that the money exists. Cash sitting there changes the way a person walks through the world long before it is ever touched. It changes tone. It changes the willingness to say no. A man with no savings may tolerate nonsense from a boss because next week's rent has already claimed his courage. A woman with no buffer may remain in a bad job, a bad lease, a bad arrangement, or a bad city because every transition looks like a cliff. People call this caution. Often it is captivity. $10,000 does not buy freedom in the grandest sense, but it often buys the first honest inch of negotiating room. And negotiating room is where dignity begins to return. I have always thought one of the strangest features of money is that a modest amount can alter behavior more than a much larger amount that arrives later. By the time someone reaches $100,000, they usually already possess the habits, restraint, and perspective that made it possible. The internal revolution happened earlier. The psychological turn happened when money first stopped disappearing the moment it arrived. That is why the first $10,000 deserves more respect than it usually gets. It is not just a savings target, it is a reclassification of self. Before that point, many people see themselves as people who are trying to keep up. After that point, they begin to suspect they may be people who can build. That identity shift is not sentimental language. It has practical consequences. A person who sees himself as a saver looks at the world differently from a person who sees himself as a spender who occasionally tries to behave. He notices recurring leaks. He sees the subscription that no longer earns its keep. He sees the expensive convenience habit that delivers 3 minutes of relief and steals 3 years of compounding. He sees that the issue was never just the paycheck. The issue was the pattern. When a person reaches $10,000, he has usually done more than move money into an account. He has proved something to himself. He has proved he can delay relief. He has proved he can resist the itch to reward every hard day with consumption. He has proved he can build a wall one brick at a time, even when nobody is applauding the first few bricks. That proof matters more than the money. Plenty of high-income people never acquire it. I have seen people make extraordinary salaries and still live financially exposed. They surround themselves with symbols of success and remain one disruption away from acting desperate. Their cars are expensive, their watches are expensive, their apartment lobbies smell expensive, their financial structure is flimsy. Then I meet someone earning a far more ordinary income who has $10,000, then $20,000, then $50,000. That person may not look glamorous, but he has something more valuable than glamour. He has margin. Margin is one of the most underappreciated assets in life. In business, margin of safety protects you from error. In personal finance, margin protects you from panic. Those are related ideas. The world is full of people who are smart enough to make money and too exposed to keep it. The first $10,000 does not fix every weakness, but it begins teaching the single most important lesson in wealth building. Keeping money is different from touching money. A lot of people touch money. Very few develop the character to keep it. That is why I do not get excited when someone tells me his income doubled. I pay closer attention when he tells me his life no longer requires every dollar to arrive, pre-assigned to some crisis. Income is potential. Saved cash is evidence. There is also a physical side to this that people rarely discuss. Honestly, when money is thin, the body knows. You may tell yourself you are managing. Your shoulders know better. Your sleep knows better. Your patience with your family knows better. Your attention span at work knows better. The body interprets uncertainty as threat, especially repeated uncertainty. It does not care that you are trying hard. It only notices that danger seems to arrive faster than preparation. A person living paycheck to paycheck often lives in a state of low-grade alarm. It may look normal from the outside because millions of people live this way. But widespread does not mean healthy. It simply means common. Then cash begins to accumulate. The first $1,000 helps. The second proves the first was not an accident. By the time the account crosses 5 digits, the body starts receiving a different message. The message is not, everything is safe forever. The message is, not every problem is fatal. That is enough to change sleep. It is enough to change tone with a spouse. It is enough to change the quality of a conversation at dinner. It is enough to let a person focus on the task in front of him instead of the 3 disasters that might be waiting at home. You would be amazed how many poor decisions are made by tired people whose real problem is not lack of intelligence, but constant financial static in the background. 10,000 does not make them geniuses. It simply lowers the static. And when the static drops, judgment improves. That is why emergency savings often lead to better decisions in areas that seem unrelated to money. The person with savings is more patient, more measured, less eager to escape discomfort by spending, less likely to interpret every challenge as humiliation, less likely to say yes to bad terms. That matters at work. It matters in relationships. It matters in business. It matters everywhere. One of the great hidden advantages of cash is that it gives you the power to wait a little longer and think a little better. Waiting is a rich person's weapon, not because rich people are naturally wise, but because they are less likely to be cornered by the clock. A person with no cushion is constantly being cornered by the clock. He needs the paycheck now. He needs the refund now. He needs the side job now. He needs the broken thing to hold together one more month. Time becomes an enemy. Cash changes that relationship. $10,000 does not buy endless time, but it buys enough time to avoid a surprising number of bad bargains. That is one reason the number matters so much. Without a buffer, opportunities are often indistinguishable from risks. A course that could raise earning power looks expensive. A move to a better market looks reckless. A short stretch between jobs looks terrifying. A networking trip looks indulgent. A chance to hold out for better terms looks irresponsible. People say they want opportunity. Often what they lack is the cash reserve required to recognize one when it appears. That is why the first emergency fund ends up financing more than emergencies. It finances judgment. It finances selectivity. It finances mobility. It finances the ability to choose a slightly harder path today because you are no longer choking on immediate necessity. That is a profound shift. When I was younger, I learned that compounding does not begin in the stock market. It begins in conduct. The person who saves the first $10,000 has usually begun compounding self-trust. He tells himself he is going to set something aside. Then he does it. He tells himself he is not going to spend money merely because he is tired, bored, or envious. Then he does not. He tells himself a future version of his life deserves protection. Then he acts like he believes it. That is not a small thing. Most lives are shaped by repeated private decisions that nobody else witnesses. What coffee to buy, whether to order again, whether to keep the car one more year, whether to refinance the ego or the balance sheet, whether to spend to appear successful or save to become secure. The first $10,000 is built out of such decisions. That is why I do not think of it as a pile of money. I think of it as crystallized behavior. It is proof that discipline was repeated often enough to become visible. And once it becomes visible, a person begins to relate to himself differently. He stops seeing saving as a temporary punishment. He starts seeing it as evidence of who he is. That difference is enormous. Temporary punishment always ends in rebellion. Identity is steadier. If a person believes saving is just a season of suffering before real-life resumes, he will almost certainly overspend the moment he feels he has earned a break. But if he believes he is the kind of person who protects margin, then the behavior holds through good months and bad months. The habit becomes less theatrical and more durable. That is the real threshold the first 10,000 marks. Not wealth, durability. And durability is what eventually creates wealth. I often tell people that the first million is hard. What I really mean is that the first evidence of durable behavior is hard. Once a person has proved he can hold cash, keep a promise to himself, and resist lifestyle inflation, the game changes, not because it becomes effortless, but because the engine has been built. Before 10,000, many people are still assembling the engine. After 10,000, the machine may begin to run. 10,000 is not a magic charm. It will not cover every calamity. It will not compensate for foolishness. It will not save a person who insists on treating every raise like permission to spend more, and it will not cure a life built on obligations that were never affordable in the first place. But if we are talking about ordinary life, ordinary setbacks, ordinary strain, then 10,000 covers more than most people appreciate. A car repair, a dental problem, a medical deductible, a few months of essential bills if spending is not absurd, a broken laptop for someone who works online, a sudden plane ticket, a move, a legal fee, a pause between jobs. The list is not glamorous. That is exactly the point. Most financial pain does not arrive dressed as some cinematic catastrophe. It arrives as mundane disruption. That is what wipes people out. Not one giant tragedy, but repeated medium-sized hits, landing on a system with no shock absorber. 10,000 is often the first real shock absorber. Once that cushion exists, A person discovers something the culture rarely advertises because it is not photogenic. Peace is productive. A calmer mind notices waste. A calmer mind compares insurance rates. A calmer mind reads the terms before signing. A calmer mind questions the payment plan that looked inevitable when panic was steering. A calmer mind can think, perhaps I do not need the more expensive apartment. Perhaps I do not need the new car. Perhaps I do not need to consume my entire paycheck simply because I can. This is where money starts multiplying options instead of merely passing through your hands before savings. Every dollar seems final. Spend it and it is gone. After savings, money begins to reveal a second function. It does not merely purchase objects, it purchases flexibility. Flexibility is one of the greatest luxuries in the world. It lets you change your mind without being ruined. It lets you leave something stupid without begging. It lets you withstand an unlucky quarter without declaring defeat. It lets you look at a bad deal and say, "No, I can wait." That sentence is worth a fortune when spoken at the right time. No, I can wait. No, I do not need to take the first job. No, I do not need to renew the lease under these terms. No, I do not need to use debt to preserve an image. No, I do not need to stay in a situation that is draining the life out of me. Most people would like to say those words more often. Savings is what puts breath behind them. I also believe the first 10,000 changes how you evaluate status. When you have no buffer, appearances can feel strangely important. A person may cling to visible markers because they are easier to display than stability. The nice car can be seen, the reserve account cannot, the branded lifestyle can be photographed, the emergency fund cannot. That is one reason insecure people are so easy to market to. Consumer culture is always whispering the same lie. If you look prosperous enough, you will feel secure. In reality, looking prosperous and feeling secure are often enemies. Many of the purchases that create the first sensation destroy the second. The first 10,000 teaches that lesson vividly. Once a person has tasted the emotional relief of cash, a lot of fake status begins to lose its flavor. The restaurant meal still tastes fine. The upgraded car still smells nice. The impulsive purchase still delivers its little spark. But now there is something to compare it against. There is the feeling of opening the banking app and seeing proof that you can survive inconvenience without collapsing. That feeling is hard to replace once experienced. I have known very wealthy people who never learned this lesson, and I have known modest people who learned it early and built sturdy lives because of it. The difference was rarely intelligence. It was appetite and perspective. People tend to imagine that wealth building is mostly about earning more. Earning more helps. It is not the core lesson of the first 10,000. The core lesson is that your future can be funded by restraint as well as ambition. That is a mature idea. A person who learns it early gains decades. A person who never learns it can remain highly paid and perpetually fragile. And fragility is expensive. There is another subtle transformation that occurs at this milestone. Decision fatigue falls. When money is tight, a person makes dozens of exhausting microcalculations each day. Can I buy this? Can I go? Can I replace that? Should I delay? Can I risk it? Should I wait for payday? Can I let this slide one more month? Each question is tiny together. They are exhausting. By the end of the day, the person is not merely poor in dollars. He is poor in attention. The first 10,000 does not remove all decisions, but it removes many survival decisions. That is a major release of mental energy. Now, the grocery trip is not an identity crisis. Now, the small repair is not a referendum on the week. Now, the invitation from friends is evaluated by desire and schedule, not by fear. This may sound trivial to someone who has never lived the other way. It is not trivial. Tiny humiliations accumulate. So does the relief of no longer having to experience them every day. A person with savings stands a little straighter in ordinary life because money is no longer interrupting every ordinary moment. That confidence tends to leak into other arenas. Salary negotiations improve, job interviews improve, conversations improve. There is less hidden desperation in the voice. The person is no longer pleading silently with the world to be gentle this month. He can listen, he can think, he can ask for terms, he can refuse bad ones, and that often leads to outcomes that make the savings grow even faster. This is one of the most beautiful feedback loops in money. Security improves behavior, improves outcomes. Improved outcomes increase security. But the loop must begin. For many people, it begins with the first 10,000. I do not want to romanticize the road to get there for many households. The first 1,000 is ugly. The second is not much prettier. Saving feels slow when there is no momentum. It feels unfair. It feels pointless. The account grows in amounts too small to impress anybody. And meanwhile, the world keeps tempting, billing, upgrading, and demanding. This is where most people quit. Not because they are incapable, because the early stage of saving is visually unrewarding. It asks for repetitive discipline before there is any impressive result to point to. That is why I say the first 10,000 is built long before it appears. It is built when somebody decides not to use every extra dollar as anesthesia. It is built when a raise does not immediately become a car payment. It is built when boredom is not allowed to vote on spending. It is built when convenience is treated as a luxury instead of a right. It is built when a person finally admits that many budget problems are not emergencies at all. They are habits with good public relations. The culture will not say this kindly, so I will. A good portion of everyday financial struggle comes from paying premium prices to avoid tiny discomforts. Delivery instead of pickup, new instead of used monthly, instead of annual, branded instead of functional, financed instead of delayed, convenient instead of wise. I am not against spending. I am against thoughtless spending pretending to be necessity. If a person redirects only part of that leakage long enough to build a reserve, he often discovers something shocking. The reserve itself reduces the urge for some of the leakage. That is because many purchases were attempts to medicate stress, and some of that stress begins to fade once the buffer exists. This is why a proper savings milestone often changes more than the balance sheet. It changes the emotional economy of the household. Arguments decline. Resentment declines. The need to escape through spending declines. People feel less hunted. A marriage can feel different when one broken transmission no longer threatens the month. Parenting can feel different when a doctor visit does not require a private panic attack in the parking lot. Work can feel different when a bad week no longer carries the same terror. Life does not become easy. It becomes less brittle. And brittleness is one of the great enemies of good judgment. I have long believed that good investing begins with emotional stability. It is hard to think clearly about long-term compounding, while your immediate life is one unexpected bill away from disorder. That is why telling a financially exposed person to just invest more can be foolish advice. The foundation must come first. 10,000 often serves as the first real foundation, not because it is a sacred number handed down by economists, because it is large enough to absorb many common shocks and small enough to be reachable for ordinary people with enough consistency. That reachability matters. A goal must be meaningful, but it must also be believable. 10,000 is one of those rare numbers that sits at the intersection of psychological power and practical usefulness. It is high enough to command respect. It is low enough to be pursued. That is why it changes people. A person who has saved 10,000 is not merely someone who has money. He is someone who has demonstrated endurance. He has said no many times when yes would have been easier. He has resisted comparison. He has lived below what he could have displayed. He has tolerated the slow pace of visible progress. He has built a private asset in a culture obsessed with public display. That sort of person is beginning to become dangerous. In the best sense, dangerous to debt traps, dangerous to manipulative marketing, dangerous to bad employers, dangerous to the belief that he must remain one paycheck from fear forever. And once a person becomes dangerous to those forces, the future starts to look different. Now he can think about the next layer, not luxury, not showing off. The next layer, a larger reserve, a retirement contribution, a brokerage account, a business idea funded carefully instead of desperately, a move made from strategy rather than emotion. This is another important point. The first 10,000 often marks the moment a person stops seeing money as something that vanishes and starts seeing it as something that can be positioned. That is a profound intellectual change. Positioning money is the beginning of investing. Even before a single share, you are no longer merely a consumer of income. You are becoming an allocator of capital. That may sound lofty for an emergency fund. It is not lofty at all. It is accurate. Capital allocation begins the moment a dollar is no longer automatically assigned to immediate consumption. That is why I say the first 10,000 changes a life. It changes the role money plays in the mind. Before, money was a visitor. Now, it can become an employee, a modest employee, to be sure, but an employee nonetheless. And once a person has one employee, he may learn how to hire more. I also want to say something that younger people especially need to hear. 10,000 saved is not insignificant because someone on the internet claims 7 figures is the real benchmark. ignore that noise. There will always be somebody performing wealth louder than you. There will always be an account online telling you that anything less than complete financial domination is basically failure. That is nonsense. Real life is built out of thresholds, not performances. The first 10,000 is one of the great thresholds because it often changes what kinds of mistakes are survivable. That is, everything. A life in which small mistakes are survivable is a life that can improve. A life in which every mistake is fatal stays timid, reactive, and easy to control. So no, 10,000 is not the end of the road. It is the first stretch of road where the car is less likely to break apart every time you hit a pothole. That is worth celebrating. But it is also worth protecting. Once a person reaches this milestone, the temptation to declare victory can be strong. The mind wants a reward for discipline. It says, I have been good. I deserve something. Just a little. That voice is understandable and dangerous. The purpose of the first reserve is not to audition for spending. The purpose is to become a permanent layer of protection underneath the rest of life. If it must be used, so be it. That is what it is there for. But it should not be treated as pent-up pleasure. It should be treated as the base. A foundation is not exciting because it is always visible. A foundation is valuable because the house depends on it. The people who turn the first 10,000 into real wealth are usually not the ones who reach it fastest. They are the ones who stop treating it like a temporary stunt and start treating it like part of their identity. They do not say, I managed to save 10,000. They say, in effect, I am now someone who keeps margin. That shift is quiet. Quiet shifts are often the most important. When behavior becomes identity, progress becomes much easier to sustain. The saver stops arguing with himself about every small sacrifice because he no longer experiences it as sacrifice. He experiences it as alignment. This is who I am. I keep some. I protect the downside. I do not spend every raise. I do not borrow to decorate insecurity. I do not treat cash reserves as optional. I do not let temporary feelings vote on permanent money decisions. These are not just personal finance slogans. They are character statements. And character compounds. It compounds in money. It compounds in trust. It compounds in marriage. It compounds in business. It compounds in every place where delayed gratification produces a better future than impulse ever could. The world likes to ask people what they would do if they had $1 million. I am more interested in what they would stop doing if they had 10,000. Would they stop tolerating bad terms? Would they stop fearing every phone notification from the bank? Would they stop postponing useful decisions? Because all useful decisions require some cushion. Would they stop buying little doses of relief that keep them broke? Would they stop confusing motion with progress? Those are better questions because they get closer to the real power of money. The real power of money is not display. It is reduced compulsion. The less compelled you are by immediate fear, the more intelligently you can live. That is why I smile when somebody tells me he has finally reached his first 5-figure reserve. I know what that number really means. It means he has probably been through months, perhaps years, of saying no when nobody would have blamed him for saying yes. It means he has learned that security feels better than performance. It means he may finally understand that wealth starts as behavior long before it becomes a headline number. It means he is becoming the sort of person who can handle larger sums because he has learned to respect smaller ones. And that may be the most important lesson of all. Large fortunes are usually mishandled by people who never learn to honor modest reserves. They think capital is for the wiser people learn that capital is first for protection, then for optionality, then for growth. 10,000 teaches that order, protection first, then optionality, then growth. Get the order wrong and money leaks away no matter how impressive the income. Get the order right, and even an ordinary income can begin building an extraordinary life. So if you are working toward your first 10,000, do not dismiss the goal because it is not flashy enough for the age of social media. Flash is not the point. The point is that you are trying to cross from fragility to footing, from reaction to intention, from fear to a little breathing room, from spending because life feels hard to saving, so life can become less hard. That is serious work. The people who do it are rarely celebrated at the beginning because the evidence is hidden in bank statements instead of driveway photos. But I have watched enough lives to know which kind of evidence matters more. The hidden kind, the quiet reserve, the invisible margin, the money that allows a person to behave with patience and self-respect when the world becomes difficult. That is not the final definition of wealth. It is the beginning of it, and beginnings deserve more reverence than they usually receive. If I were speaking to a young person who felt discouraged because 10,000 still seemed far away, I would tell him not to worship the distance. I would tell him to worship the direction. Direction is what changes destiny. If the account is moving upward and the identity is becoming steadier, then the important transformation is already underway. The first 1,000 felt impossible until it existed. The first 5,000 felt slow until it began to feel normal. The first 10,000 will feel enormous right up until the day it becomes your floor instead of your dream. That is another marvel of money. What once looked unreachable eventually becomes ordinary if the behavior underneath it is strong enough. But the behavior matters far more than the number. Never forget that. The account is a scoreboard. The real game is self-command. The real victory is that one day you stop living as if every inconvenience deserves the emotional rank of catastrophe. One day you stop reaching for the card every time fatigue asks for relief. One day you stop needing to impress people whose opinions were costing you compounding. One day you stop feeling personally attacked by every ordinary expense. One day you look at your reserve and realize the most important thing it purchased was not a car repair, not a deductible, not a month of breathing room. It purchased a different version of you, a calmer one, a more selective one, a more patient one, a less frightened one, and that person, far more than the 10,000 itself, is the one who will go on to build real wealth. That is why I respect the milestone. Not because it is the finish line, because it is the first honest sign that the race is finally being run in the right direction.